What if the greatest voices of the ancient world were never truly lost, but deliberately erased? What if the poetesses who shaped entire generations, inspired revolutions of thought, and carried the emotional pulse of their civilizations were not forgotten by chance, but silenced with intention? This opening question is not just a provocation. It is an invitation to look at history without the filters that have softened its cruelty. Because when you begin to trace the faint echoes of these erased women, you discover that the violence committed against them went far beyond censorship. Their names were scraped off tablets, their verses rewritten by male hands, their legacies stolen, and their memories buried under centuries of manipulation. And yet, even with every force pushing them into oblivion, fragments of their brilliance still leak through the cracks of time. The truth is that the ancient world was filled with female minds capable of altering culture, philosophy, and art, but nearly every system around them worked to ensure they would never be remembered. As you listen to the stories behind these erased poetesses, ask yourself something simple but uncomfortable. If their voices survived even after attempts to destroy them, what else was hidden? What else is still being concealed, waiting for us to uncover? Before we continue, tell me what this theme awakens in you. Leave a comment sharing your first impression. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the rest of this investigation. And leave a like to help this content reach more people who want to understand what truly happened. And as we move forward, hold on to this feeling of discovery. Because what comes next deepens the shadows around these forgotten women and the forces that silence them. They say history remembers those who left their mark. But what happens when the mark is intentionally wiped away? When you examine the earliest traces of the pre-classical world, the landscape looks strangely empty of women, as if none of them ever lifted a stylus, shaped a verse, or dared to turn emotion into art. But this emptiness is an illusion carefully crafted over centuries. In the oldest literary traditions, women were not absent. They were present in temples, in courts, in oral circles, composing hymns, elegies, and chants that shaped the identities of their communities. Their poetry carried spiritual weight, political nuance, and emotional resonance. Yet most of what they produced never passed. Through time, not because their works were weaker or less valued, but because the guardians of the written record chose to let their names fade. In the pre-classical period, literacy was often controlled by elites, and the elites were overwhelmingly male. This created a funnel through which only certain voices could survive. When male scribes copied texts, they prioritized what aligned with their worldview. Female authorship rarely did. So even when a woman's work was respected in her own lifetime, it could easily vanish with the passing of a generation. Some poetesses were allowed to exist only in whispers, remembered in passing by men who mentioned them without preserving their lines. Others were reduced to anonymous figures, with verses fragmented and reattributed to male contemporaries, as if authorship itself belonged exclusively to them. This pattern of invisibility was not an accident. It was a slow, mechanical process of exclusion, guided by a cultural belief that the intellectual and creative realm was not a place for women to leave permanent traces. Girls who composed were seen as curiosities, not as members of a tradition worth archiving. Their poems circulated orally, performed in rituals or domestic gatherings, vulnerable to the erosion of time and the biases of those who later decided what deserved to be written. Many of these women lived in societies where a single accusation, a single rumor, or a single powerful man could erase decades of artistic work. Their memory depended on the goodwill of chroniclers who rarely found value in female genius. When the first written canons were assembled, when kingdoms drafted their official histories, and when religious authorities began to define which texts mattered, these poetesses were quietly pushed out. Some were remembered only through misattributed fragments. Others survived only because a stray mention appeared in a commentary or an inscription. The pre-classical world was full of women whose voices resonated strongly in their communities, but those voices were filtered through layers of power that decided who deserved longevity. This is why today their presence appears faint, scattered like ashes caught in the wind, leaving us to piece together what remains and wonder how much more was once there, just beyond our reach. When you move deeper into the ancient world, the pattern becomes unmistakable. The disappearance of female authors was not the result of scattered accidents or tragic coincidences. It was systematic, intentional, and rooted in structures that controlled what could be remembered and what should be forgotten. Every civilization that built libraries, archives, or literary canons also built gatekeeping systems, and those systems decided whose voice deserved permanence. Women rarely fit into those criteria, no matter how profound their contributions were. The men who curated culture defined themselves as the primary interpreters of knowledge, and everything that fell outside their lens was quietly pushed away. In many early societies, the act of writing was intertwined with religious or political authority, both of which were dominated by men who believed female intellect belonged in the private sphere. When women wrote, they were tolerated only as anomalies, never as pillars of a tradition. Their talent was often dismissed as emotional excess, their insight treated as decorative rather than foundational. This made the preservation of their work incredibly fragile. A single scribe deciding a text was uninteresting could let it rot. A priest believing a woman's words were spiritually inappropriate could bury or destroy them. An archivist choosing which tablets deserved to be recopied could eliminate an entire generation of female perspectives with the stroke of a brush. Even when women achieved recognition in their own time, their legacies depended on the men who later edited, selected, and canonized literature. Many ancient anthologies were assembled centuries after the authors lived, giving editors the power to reshape history according to their beliefs. Female voices were often seen as minor, peripheral, or even dangerous. Their writings could challenge social norms, criticize power, or express emotional autonomy, all of which made them inconvenient. So their names were removed, their verses reassigned, their contributions merged into the anonymity that still shadows them today. Manuscripts attributed to men sometimes contain stylistic anomalies that hint at hidden authorship. Others show signs of revision where the original name may have been scraped off or overwritten. The erasure did not happen only through omission. It also happened through reinterpretation. Male commentators rewrote the context of female works, framing them according to their own assumptions. Some poetesses were transformed into myths, their real lives distorted or moralized to fit patriarchal expectations. Others were dismissed as curiosities, or rumored lovers of powerful men, as if their artistic worth required a male figure to justify their existence. These reinterpretations created layers of distance that continued to bury the original intent of their words. What remains today are fragments, mentions, and traces scattered across centuries of selective memory. The systematic erasure of female authors was so effective that historians often cannot reconstruct even the names behind certain works. It leaves us with an unsettling question about how different our understanding of the ancient world would be if the voices of these women had survived intact. Their absence is not silent. It shapes everything we think we know. And as we continue to follow their fading footprints, the weight of what was lost becomes impossible to ignore, guiding us toward a deeper investigation into how patriarchal systems engineered a literary landscape where female genius struggled to exist at all. In the ancient world, violence against women who dared to write did not always take the form of chains, prisons, or visible punishment. Much of it happened in silence, in the shadows where power prefers to operate. A woman who raised her voice through poetry became more than an artist. She became a threat. Her words could expose hypocrisy, question authority, or reveal emotional depths that society preferred to ignore. This made her existence uncomfortable for those who controlled public life, and discomfort often turned into persecution. The tools used to silence these women were subtle but devastating. Their work could be censored under the justification of moral purity. Their names could be erased from manuscripts to protect the supposed dignity of the community. Their reputations could be destroyed through whispered accusations, branding them as unstable, immoral, or dangerous, simply because they dared to express themselves. For many poetesses, the danger began the moment their verses reached ears outside their household walls. A single metaphor interpreted as criticism could bring retaliation. A line expressing desire could be twisted into scandal. A poem questioning a ritual or social norm could be labeled sacrilegious. Punishments varied by culture, but the intention was the same everywhere: to teach women that knowledge, creativity, and authorship were boundaries they were not meant to cross. Some were publicly humiliated, forced to retract their words. Others were isolated, denied access to public spaces where poetry was shared. There were cases where women were physically punished or expelled from their communities, their intellectual lives shattered in an instant. Even more troubling was the psychological violence used to suppress female writers. Many were conditioned from childhood to believe that their thoughts were unworthy of preservation, that writing was a privilege reserved for men. This internalized limitation prevented countless women from ever picking up a stylus. Those who did often faced constant fear, aware that their work could provoke consequences. Their creativity became an act of resistance, performed quietly, often hidden in private diaries, or recited only to trusted confidants who might later disappear or betray them. The act of writing became a negotiation with danger, a balance between expression and survival. The silence that surrounds these stories today is not accidental. When history chooses which voices to preserve, it often avoids acknowledging the brutality behind their disappearance. The violence inflicted on ancient women writers is rarely documented, because the men responsible for recording events did not consider these women important enough to describe. What survives are hints, scattered phrases in old commentaries, references to scandals without details, or abrupt endings to literary lines where a name should have appeared. These gaps reveal the hidden mechanisms of control that shape the cultural memory of entire civilizations. And this leaves us with a lingering discomfort. If so much was erased, if so many voices were silenced before they could even be remembered, how much of the ancient world do we truly understand? The traces of these women suggest a cultural landscape richer and more complex than the one we inherited, filled with perspectives that were intentionally buried. As we continue to uncover these shadows, the weight of these untold experiences begins to reshape our perception of the past in ways that are impossible to ignore. Before we continue, tell me what this part of the story stirs in you. Leave a comment sharing what struck you the most about this hidden violence, and let your own voice echo where theirs was once suppressed. When we look at the ancient world, we often imagine the destruction of texts as the result of wars, fires, or the slow erosion of time. But when it comes to the works of women, the story is more deliberate, more methodical, and far more unsettling. Their poems did not simply vanish. Many were actively removed from existence. In societies where written culture was controlled by institutions, a manuscript could survive only if someone decided it was worth copying. If a text failed to be recopied, it slowly died. For female authors, this was almost a guarantee. Entire collections disappeared, simply because a scribe refused to spend ink on a woman's voice. What we call loss often masks a long chain of choices rooted in prejudice. In some regions, religious reforms played a decisive role. When new authorities rose, they sought to purify literary traditions, eliminating anything that conflicted with their doctrines. Female writings were often judged inappropriate for moral, spiritual, or social reasons. Some manuscripts were burned as part of ritual cleansing, their ashes scattered as if their existence had been a stain on culture. Others were buried inside sealed containers, deliberately left to decay. The erasure operated under the justification that women should not be shaping intellectual or artistic discourse. This belief was so deeply ingrained that even texts of high quality were condemned to oblivion solely because of their authorship. Another factor was the vulnerability of oral traditions. Many women composed orally, and their words were memorized by small circles rather than copied onto tablets or scrolls. When these communities dissolved, or when new cultural norms prohibited women from performing or reciting their pieces, the poems disappeared with those who carried them. Unlike male authors, whose works were preserved in official archives or educational institutions, female writers depended on fragile networks of memory. When these networks were disrupted, their voices faded rapidly. What survives today are scattered echoes, verses that somehow slipped through the cracks and ended up quoted by authors who lived centuries later. There is also evidence that some manuscripts were deliberately rewritten. Lines attributed to women appear in later male anthologies, but with their names removed or replaced. Scholars can detect shifts in style or tone that indicate multiple hands, suggesting that female verses were appropriated and adapted into male texts. This kind of literary theft ensured that the content survived while the author disappeared entirely. It is one of the most subtle yet insidious forms of destruction, because it hides violence beneath the illusion of preservation. Even the physical materials women used worked against them. In many cultures, men had access to durable writing surfaces, while women wrote on cheaper, temporary materials that decayed more quickly. This practical disadvantage created yet another layer of loss. The few surviving references to their work often come from male critics, whose interpretations were filtered through their own biases. These secondary accounts distort the original intent and leave us with a hollow representation of what once existed. As we sift through what remains, the fragments reveal not just creativity, but resistance. Every piece that survived implies that many more were destroyed with intention, leaving us to reconstruct their presence from the shadows they left behind. The weight of these losses challenges our understanding of ancient literature and exposes how deeply gendered power shaped the transmission of cultural memory. In the ancient world, writing was not merely an intellectual pursuit. It was an act that carried social, political, and sometimes even spiritual weight. For women, this made authorship a dangerous form of defiance. The price they paid was often far greater than the loss of their manuscripts. Some paid with their safety, others paid with their future, and some, tragically, paid with their lives. When a woman wrote, she challenged a hierarchy that insisted she remain silent, obedient, and invisible. Her words marked her as someone who stepped beyond the boundaries imposed on her. Someone who dared to exist in a way society refused to accept. And in cultures where control over knowledge meant control over people, such defiance could provoke brutal consequences. Historical traces reveal that certain female writers were accused of immorality or witchcraft simply because their poetry reflected desire, grief, or independent thought. In communities where women were expected to be modest and discreet, expressive writing became a form of rebellion, interpreted as social threat. A poem could be twisted into evidence of forbidden behavior. A metaphor could be interpreted as a coded insult to authority. The mere act of writing could trigger suspicion. Once targeted, a woman could be banished, beaten, publicly shamed, or forced into silence. The accusations were less about truth and more about reinforcing control. When punishment escalated, it was often justified through claims that her writing had destabilized moral order. There are records of women who faced execution because their verses were seen as politically subversive. In societies where rulers feared public opinion, even a symbolic threat could provoke harsh retaliation. A single line hinting at injustice could be framed as sedition. A mournful elegy could be accused of promoting unrest. Female poetesses lacked the political alliances and protective networks that male authors often enjoyed. Without powerful patrons, they were easy targets for those who wished to make an example of them. Silence was enforced through terror. sending a message that female creativity carried risks too dangerous to bear. Some women died indirectly, destroyed by the isolation imposed after their works were condemned. Exiled from their communities, stripped of resources or separated from their families, many did not survive the consequences of being branded as intellectual threats. Others were forced into religious institutions where their lives were controlled, their creative spirit suffocated. For some, the trauma of suppression became a slow execution hidden beneath the surface of official records. What makes these stories even more tragic is that the very violence they faced contributed to the disappearance of their names. History often preserved the acts of those who punished them, while erasing the identities of the women who suffered. Their deaths were not documented as injustices, but as moral or legal necessities. Their writings vanished along with their lives, leaving later generations with only hints of what once existed. And yet, these faint traces reveal that the fear they inspired in those who silenced them was not about the content of their work, but about the power of a woman who dared to think, to feel, to speak, and to leave a mark. As we look back at these fragmented accounts, the magnitude of what was lost becomes clearer. These women were not merely writers. They were voices capable of redefining cultural landscapes. Their disappearance was not inevitable. It was engineered through violence directed at those who dared to cross the boundaries of their time, showing us how deeply the ancient world feared the force of a woman who refused to be erased. When you examine the surviving manuscripts of the ancient world, you begin to notice something unsettling. The handwriting, the edits, the marginal notes, the corrections and the revisions almost always belong to men. Not because men were the only ones who wrote, but because they were the ones granted authority over the written record. This meant that a woman's voice, once committed to a fragile piece of papyrus or clay, entered a world controlled by hands that often did not respect, understand, or even tolerate what she had created. The male scribes who transmitted literature across generations did more than simply copy. They curated, interpreted, and sometimes mutilated the texts they handled. And when a manuscript carried the mark of female authorship, it was especially vulnerable to interference. In some cases, entire sections of a poem were removed because they were considered too bold, too emotional, or too subversive. Lines expressing female desire were labeled inappropriate. Passages critiquing society or authority were marked as dangerous. Instead of preserving the original intent, scribes softened, corrected, or replaced them with phrases more aligned with the expectations of a patriarchal audience. These edits were rarely acknowledged. They became part of the text's lineage, masking the intervention as faithful transmission. Scholars today can trace some of these alterations through linguistic inconsistencies or abrupt stylistic shifts, but many distortions remain undetectable, hidden beneath centuries of accepted interpretation. There were also moments when a scribe erased the author's name entirely, replacing it with his own, or assigning the text to a male writer with greater cultural prestige. This act of appropriation was not seen as theft, but as correction, as if a woman's authorship was an error in need of fixing. Over time, these changes became normalized, shaping literary canons that appeared exclusively male, even though they were built on voices that had been forcibly rewritten. The original identities dissolved, leaving later generations with distorted versions of works that no longer reflected the minds that created them. Some male editors went further, adding commentary that reframed a woman's writing through their own assumptions. When a female poem expressed autonomy, they described it as hysteria. When it conveyed longing, they minimized it as emotional instability. When it revealed intelligence or spiritual insight, they dismissed it as accidental inspiration rather than deliberate craft. These interpretations influenced how subsequent generations read and valued the text, often turning masterpieces into curiosities or moral warnings. The distortions became part of cultural memory, embedding patriarchal bias into the very fabric of the literature that survived. In rare cases where a female author's name persisted, scribes sometimes altered her biography to fit narratives more acceptable to male audiences. They reshaped her life into legend, often linking her to a male figure or moral lesson. This mythologization created distance between the real woman and the sanitized version preserved in historical accounts. The result is a literary landscape where the original voices are heard only through layers of filters, edits, and reinterpretations that obscure what these women actually meant to say. And yet, within the cracks of these altered manuscripts, something powerful remains. The more scholars dig, the more they uncover traces of voices that were never meant to be heard again. These fragments remind us that the act of rewriting was not neutral. It was a form of control, a way of shaping the past to fit the values of those who held the pen. The weight of this realization forces us to reconsider what we think we know, and to ask how many brilliant minds were reshaped into shadows by the hands that claimed authority over their words. For centuries, we were told a comfortable lie, that women were simply not present in the intellectual life of the ancient world, that they did not write, did not compose, did not teach or debate. This narrative made it easy to justify their absence in official histories, reinforcing the idea that the cultural landscape was shaped almost exclusively by men. But when you follow the faint traces left behind, the lie begins to unravel. Women were not absent, they were erased. Their contributions were woven into daily life, ritual traditions, local communities, and artistic circles, but the systems responsible for preserving the past chose to highlight only the voices they deemed legitimate. The silence we inherited is not a reflection of what happened, but of what was allowed to survive. In many ancient societies, women composed poetry for marriages, funerals, and festivals, creating works that shaped collective memory long before they had the chance to be written down. They sang hymns in temples, crafted verses for healing rituals, and whispered stories that traveled quietly across generations. Their creativity existed in spaces historians once dismissed as domestic or informal, yet these spaces were often central to cultural identity. What blurred their presence was not a lack of participation, but a lack of recognition. When male scholars later examined the literary tradition, they privileged texts produced in elite, institutional settings, ignoring the vibrant artistic activity that existed beyond those walls. There were even women who held respected positions as musicians, priestesses, and educators, roles that often required sophisticated knowledge of language and symbolic expression. Some were known in their own time, celebrated within their communities, mentioned in inscriptions or remembered in local myths. Others gained reputations that stretched across regions, inspiring admiration or envy. But as written culture evolved, their influence was gradually displaced. The creation of official canons pushed aside anything that did not fit strict definitions of literary worth, and those definitions were shaped by male thinkers who saw their own perspective as universal. The myth of female absence also benefited later historians. It simplified the narrative of intellectual development, presenting male authorship as a natural and uncontested path. This made it easier to overlook inconsistencies, such as stylistic features in male-attributed texts that hint at alternative authorship, or oral traditions that abruptly lose female contributors at the moment written records become dominant. The disconnect between lived cultural experience and preserved documents reveals how much was filtered out. What is even more revealing is the growing body of evidence showing that certain poetic forms, symbolic structures, and narrative motifs found in ancient literature likely originated in communities where women had significant cultural influence. Their ideas, shaped by different experiences and perspectives, helped form the foundations of art and storytelling. But over time, these origins were obscured, replaced by the version of history that suited the dominant power structures. The intellectual evolution of entire civilizations may have been far more collaborative than our surviving texts suggest. When we acknowledge A profound shift occurs. The supposed absence of women is no longer a void. It becomes a map of what was intentionally overshadowed. Their presence was woven through religions, rituals, family networks, healing practices, and local artistry. They existed in the very fabric of daily life, contributing to culture in ways that remain partially visible even after centuries of erasure. These traces invite us to question the narratives we inherited and to imagine the fuller, richer landscape that once existed behind them. When you examine the modern understanding of literature, you quickly realize that the absence of ancient female voices did not stay confined to the past. It shaped the very foundations of how we read, interpret, and value writing today. The erasure of poetesses from antiquity created a distorted lineage in which male perspectives appeared to be the natural starting point of artistic expression. This skewed foundation influenced both academic and cultural narratives for centuries. Generations of scholars looked at the overwhelmingly male canon and concluded wrongly that women lacked the intellectual drive or emotional depth to contribute significantly to early literature. This misconception shaped educational systems, literary criticism, and even public perception, long before anyone questioned whether the silence was artificial. Because their works were destroyed or reassigned, modern readers inherited a literary history that feels incomplete, as though entire chambers of human experience had been sealed shut. The themes we associate with ancient poetry reflect only part of the emotional and intellectual world those civilizations once contained. Without the perspectives of women, we lost insights into domestic life, spiritual rituals, interpersonal relationships, grief, motherhood, and desire that only they could articulate from their lived experiences. This reduced the richness and diversity of ancient literature, leaving us with a curated version that mirrors the worldview of the men who controlled cultural memory. The gap created by this absence affects not only historians, but also contemporary writers who look to the past for inspiration. The long-term consequences extend beyond literature. The suppression of female authorship in antiquity contributed to enduring stereotypes about women's intellectual capacity. For centuries, critics used the apparent lack of ancient female writers as evidence that women were not naturally inclined toward creativity or scholarship. This flawed argument fueled restrictions on women's education, justified exclusion from academic institutions, and reinforced social norms that kept them away from writing. The belief that women were newcomers to intellectual life became a self-perpetuating myth, creating barriers that persisted well into the modern era. The violence inflicted on ancient poetesses echoed forward, shaping opportunities for women across multiple generations. Even the fragments that survive today are tinged with the distortions created by male interpreters. Researchers studying ancient literature must constantly navigate layers of commentary and editing that obscure original contexts. This makes it difficult to reconstruct an accurate picture of female expression. The absence of intact works from ancient women creates a void that scholars attempt to fill through speculation, comparison, and linguistic analysis. But the process always reveals how much has been lost. The intellectual landscape we inherited feels uneven, tilted toward voices that were preserved, while others were systematically suppressed. The modern consequences also involve the way we understand cultural evolution. Without acknowledging the contributions of ancient poetesses, we risk believing that certain artistic developments emerged solely from male innovation. This misconception shapes how we interpret shifts in symbolism, poetic structure, and emotional expression in the ancient world. The truth is that cultural transformation was far more collaborative, but the intentional silencing of women distorts our understanding of how ideas traveled, changed, and influenced societies. Every missing poem, every erased name, and every rewritten line alters the map of human creativity we rely on today. And yet, as researchers unearth new evidence, reinterpret old manuscripts, and follow the faint threads left behind, a slow reconstruction begins. The shadows cast by these erased Women reveal the contours of a hidden tradition, one that may reshape our understanding of literature as more fragments come to light. Their absence still reverberates, but the recognition of that void marks the beginning of a deeper exploration of what was once buried. Even after centuries of erasure, some traces of these ancient poetesses remain, faint but persistent, like stars visible only when the night is darkest. Their legacy survives in fragments of text, in references by later writers, in inscriptions carved into stone, or hidden in the margins of manuscripts. These remnants remind us that even under the most systematic efforts to silence them, their voices had power that could not be entirely suppressed. Each fragment, each surviving line, carries with it a resistance that speaks louder than the censorship imposed upon them. It tells us that the creative spirit, once ignited, is nearly impossible to extinguish, and that the work of recovery is as much about honoring their courage as it is about reconstructing history. Modern scholars now work meticulously to piece together what remains, searching through commentary, citations, palimpsests, and damaged texts to trace the threads of female authorship that persist, despite centuries of deliberate neglect. Every new discovery challenges the narrative that women were absent from the cultural and literary landscapes of the ancient world. Instead, it paints a picture of resilience, ingenuity, and persistence, showing how women navigated oppressive structures, crafted meaningful works, and influenced communities in ways that were often invisible to the dominant historical record. The reconstruction of these voices is not merely an academic exercise. It is an act of reclamation, restoring agency to women whose contributions were minimized or erased. The stories of these poetesses also have profound implications for our understanding of creativity and power. They reveal how structures of authority can control which voices are amplified and which are silenced. They show the mechanisms of censorship and appropriation that shape not just what is remembered, but who is remembered. By uncovering these hidden histories, we gain insight into the broader dynamics of culture, gender, and memory. It forces us to reconsider assumptions about who contributes to intellectual history and challenges us to recognize the work that remains invisible in every inherited tradition. Each rediscovered fragment becomes a symbol of resistance and a tool for rewriting the narrative of the past. And the work does not stop there. Every reader, every researcher, every person who engages with these stories becomes part of the effort to ensure that history does not repeat the same silencing. By listening, studying, and sharing, we honor those whose voices were nearly lost. Their courage and creativity, preserved in fragments, remind us that the human spirit can endure even in the face of deliberate erasure. And as we reflect on what has survived, we also confront what remains hidden, waiting to be recovered. The process of reconstruction is ongoing, and each discovery offers a glimpse of the vast, untold potential that women once held in shaping culture and literature. If this exploration has opened your eyes to the hidden world of ancient poetesses, take a moment to leave a comment. Let me know which part of their story moved you the most, or which discovery surprised you. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss the next deep dives into voices history tried to silence, and leave a like if you want more content uncovering the untold truths of the past. There's a next story waiting just ahead that continues to expose the secrets buried by time, and it will reveal even more about the courage and creativity of women who refuse to be erased.